modern marriage is worth it? Dr. Helen Smith and TikTok Carl Miller thinks not. Over the last couple of years after no-fault divorce, many men are faced with the perilous option of whether I marry or do I stay single. As we know, the courts are not in favor of how men more or less operate, and the courts don't consider the pain and the negative outcomes of men to get married when the courts more or less don't give them the proper outcomes. I want you to enjoy this show, and I want you to ask yourself the question from this expose. Is it beneficial for modern men to get married? If it is not, and if it's not, what should men more or less focus on? Should they focus on themselves? Should they focus on world travel? Or should they focus on a system that's currently broken? Or more or less focus on trying to bring forth reform? I want you to enjoy this show on tomorrow at 11:50 a.m. And we're going to talk about the ravages of current laws as it relates to marriage and divorce. I want you to enjoy this one. And remember this, if it ain't seven, it ain't kosher. If it ain't kosher, it ain't right. You decide. Be well. So this is a culmination from a show that I did in the past, talking about what happens to a queen without a crown. Now listen, I want you guys to listen to this show, and I want you to look at what this poor man has went through. And I want you to ask yourself the question, is it beneficial for a man today in modern America to get married? I want you to listen to this video.
So how much did my divorce cost me? Well, this is a fantastic question. There's direct and there's indirect costs. Direct costs, I lost $106,000 out of my 401k retirement.
Listen, $106,000 out of his 401k. Can you imagine the pain this man is going through, knowing that he worked his whole life to get this long-term money that he invested in? You know, I always tell men, but especially to the young men that are listening, our women a lot of times are born, but men, we are made. We have to become men. We have to become great. We're born males, but we become men. Women a lot of times are born with the accoutrements, you know, nice hips, waist, breasts. But men have to become. And when you take $106,000 that you earned in assets, and now those assets are going to be divided or more or less divulged by the unjust legal system, you got to ask yourself the question, is modern marriage worth it? Now listen to this. In theory, it could be argued if the laws were fair, that marriage would be a beautiful commodity. But because of the current penal system and the current unjust laws as it relates to men, you can't argue and say that marriage is worth it in this current milieu called America. I want you to finish listening to this.
Retirement plan I spent 20 years contributing to. I also lost half the equity in the home, stocks, bonds.
It took this man 20 years. Can you imagine? 20 years to build his nest, and it'll all be gone in a puff of smoke. Now he's shattered. Now his heart is broken. Now his mind is broken. And so Kubler-Ross talks about the 5 stages of grief. And men often go through the stages of grief when they're more or less confronted with these types of social malfeasance. One could be denial. One could be, the next one is anger. And he's probably in that anger stage. The next one is bargaining. Why me? Why do I have to go through it? And then the next one is depression. Men often go through critical depression. And during that vacillation, they're at a greater risk of being a danger to themselves, because men often internalize their pain and they don't have anyone to talk to. The reason why I started this show called The Kosher Clinician is because of this, because a lot of times mental health practitioners are not addressing the negative impact on the psyche of men. Can you imagine $106,000 going down the drain? You can't recoup that. I want you to keep listening.
Mutual funds, cash, and savings that I also spent 20 years contributing to. I also lost half of all the non-liquid assets like furniture, household goods, electronics, cars. Keep in mind, I paid for all of these. And this is in addition to financially supporting her and her/our daughter for 17 years.
This is another issue that a lot of men are more or less discussing in men's circles. Many say that a man is a fool to marry a woman with kids by another man. And to some degree, I totally agree with that. Because being a stepdad is a thankless job. How many men are in the audience are stepfathers? How many men feel like the job that they have taken has been more or less thankless? And I get it. Some women will say, well, I'm a good woman. But you got to understand, most women, when they're dealing with another man that's raising their kids, you're not going to have the power to discipline those kids. That's number one. A lot of times in many instances, because that child came out of that woman's essence. The next thing you got to worry about is that she's going to put her job first, her kids first, her job, and 9 times out of 10, you're going to come third or fourth. So a lot of times being a stepdad in this current country that we live in, it's not beneficial. And I wouldn't advise it to any man. If you're a single man, focus on yourself, focus on your purpose, and focus on world travel. There are many women from other countries that will adore you, love you, and respect you. Now, I'm not here to nullify the good women out here that potentially would more or less treat a man well. But they know, and I know, that many times women don't want men to discipline their kids because that child is not that man's seed. And women are very insular in nature. They want to protect what's theirs. But however, if that child is that man's child, a woman is more willing to relinquish that power. So listen, to the young men that are single and don't have kids, I will say to you, no disrespect to the women that got kids, but I would tell young men and some older men, focus on yourself. Stay away from women with kids a lot of times, because it doesn't benefit you unless she's a special type of woman that's willing to meet all of your needs. Okay? Think about that.
Which is many hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'm now broke, live in a 2-bedroom apartment, and have a negative net worth for the first time since I was, 25. Indirect costs: my job, my sobriety, my self-worth, my masculinity, my hope for the future, my ability to trust women again, my belief in God, my pride, my motivation, my physical health. I don't know, let's just say.
And see, he's going through all the different stages of grief, like Kubler-Ross. Denial: I can't believe this happened to me. Anger: F this, you know what. Bargaining: why me? Why did I have to go through this? And then one of the other stages is depression. And many men don't get out of the depression stage because many men commit suicide at this perilous time. And that's why I'm so passionate about ensuring that a lot of men are not victims of a lot of these frays. As a clinical professional, I want to make sure that men get the proper love, care, and attention that they deserve. Because many men suffer in silence. And as I've said in the past, that a broken man is a dangerous man. And a dangerous man is a hopeless man. And I need you young men to really listen to what I'm saying, because it's going to impact you even more so. And to the older men, you probably feel like you're stuck because you don't want to be a victim of what's called a great divorce. Keep listening.
Say everything.
Very excited to have Dr. Helen Smith with me now, the author of Men on Strike, joining me now in the studio. Helen, what do you mean when you say men are on strike? How?
Men are on strike in terms of like marriage, fatherhood, and even the American dream, in the sense that they're not even going to college as often because there are so many reasons. It's just become a very bad deal for men today, and people don't realize it. People think men are immature. Like, there's all kinds of books written by Hannah Rawson, like The End of Man, and all kinds of things.
Dr. Helen Smith is one of the few advocates that advocate and more or less agrees that there's really no benefit for men to get married in modern America. That's why she wrote the book about 8 years ago called Men on Strike. And many people more or less minimize the great work of this woman, Dr. Helen Smith. You don't hear a lot about it, but I want you to go buy this book called Men on Strike. Because until we get reform in the penal system, you got to ask yourself the question, what is the benefit for a man to get married? Years ago, men had many times a virgin for their wife. Not only did they get a virgin, but they had a community that backed them up, and they had women of the community and the elders that held women accountable. But there really is no accountability now. You got men taking care of other men's kids, sometimes 2, 3, 4, and 5, and they don't have any honor and respect in their homes. But you want men to settle down, give their hard-earned money, their assets to a woman that many times won't honor and respect them, and many times see them as a utility. So I want you to go get this book by Dr. Helen Smith called Men on Strike. And I want you to continue to listen to this expose.
things about the decline of men and manning up or whatever. But I think the real thing is that men feel that right now it's just a very poor deal in terms of legal issues. Men don't get kids as often. They're only about 10% of the time do they get child custody. They're the ones paying alimony. We don't even, I just did a radio show and the guys were talking about how they literally were pushed out of the room when their baby was born and told, a mother was told that, was asked questions about, is your husband an abuser and that type.
And I want to highlight this as well, and I'm gonna finish playing this show by Dr. Helen Smith. There was a time in the world where the churches more or less gave men credence, gave them honor and valor. Many times you hear the moniker "honor thy mother and thy father," but that's not what theology teaches. Theology teaches that honor thy father and thy mother, because man was always seen as the head, and men are more or less the epigenesis to life and birth. And so when you honor your fathers, therefore, you honor the legacy of the family. But many men feel dishonor in their families because they're dealing with uncooperative women. They're dealing with women that see them as a utility. And they're dealing with women that more or less have been benefited in a system of no-fault divorce. Marriage is a business. You should never get married based on the notion of romantic love. And you might ask the question, why? Well, simply, romantic love is a novelty concept. And romantic love is the currency of a woman. But a man should more or less get married based on what's called pragmatism. And I'm going to do a show on that in the future. And pragmatism means you need to be more or less realistic. If a woman honors, respect, and obey a man is more willing to give her what she needs, which is romantic love. That's why many women, when they get married more than once, say, I would never get married for love again. Because love in itself is very fickle. Is waning. Not saying you can't be in love. Don't get it twisted. But you should never get married for love alone. For those that believe in theology, and I was a theologian that taught in the past, or I taught some of the teachings in Sunday school of the tenets of the gospel. The gospel never told the man to more or less. It never told the woman to love the man, but it did tell her to honor, to obey, and to respect her man. So therefore, the currency for a man as it relates to love is honor, reverence, and obedience. And that's a dirty word that a lot of women don't like. But the currency that a man gives to a woman is love, provision, protection. And the greatest gift that a man will give a woman is his life. And I'm going to challenge you, some of the young men and the older men, you need to start demanding what you want. You need to say, give me liberty or give me death. Because a lot of men are the victims of what I call taxation without representation. And I don't blame the women, because women only respond to power and strength. So I say to the young men, as I'm trying to mentor you, start demanding what you want out of these women. If they don't give you what you want, focus on yourself and move forward. Keep listening.
Type of thing. And it's just appalling what men go through. I mean, I used to consider myself a feminist, but I thought feminism meant equality between the sexes. But now it seems to me special privileges for women. 20 years ago when I started my private practice, I had a man in a wheelchair who was being beaten by his wife, and there was no help available for him. And it really got me thinking about, what do men do in that situation? And just the men on my blog and the readers from all over the country just prompting me and helping me to understand what men are going through in this country. And the last thing I want to say is men are not allowed to speak up. So I'm here as their sort of advocate, because if men speak up, they're called whiners, they're called, wimps, man up, and they're not allowed to talk. I talk to men across the United States on my blog. I run a men's rights blog, and I've worked with men for over 20 years in my private practice. And what I found is that men say that it's the legal ramifications. They don't have any legal rights in marriage anymore. There's something called coverture, and what it is used to men held all the cards in marriage, and they held the legal rights. Now women do. And if you look at it, men, when they get divorced, they only get custody of children 10% of the time.
Even if the woman's cheating?
If the woman's cheating, and if that's not your child, most states say you still have to pay. You find out 3 years later your 3-year-old isn't yours, you still have to pay in most states. Jim McNamara is
That's similar to what I did with paternity coach Carnell Smith. And I want you to go get this book called Trapped by Law. Can you imagine young men and older men paying for a child that's not yours? It's almost unfathomable to more or less ascertain or to assume that a child is yours and you have to pay for it for the rest of your life. And brother L.A.R. Movement wrote a book called Lessons of a Non-Custodial Father. Go check his book out as well. But see, these are some of the nuances and some of the barriers that more or less prohibit men or keep men locked in a state of suspended animation, where they're more or less saying, what are the benefits to getting married in modern America? You don't get the honor, you don't get the respect. Look what happens to men on Father's Day. They don't get nice gifts, they don't get honor, they get goofy gifts like tool bags and stupid ties. And you mean to tell me you need to become, as Dr. T. Hassan Johnson say, a concuserve? A man that more or less give a woman his body, more or less serves her? In a relationship, relationships are supposed to be synonymous. You know, Teddy Pendergrass said it better than I could say it. He said, it's so good to love somebody and somebody to love you back. But men don't get that anymore. They don't get the love, the adulation, and the respect. And I say to myself once again, what's the benefit of getting married in modern America? And really, there is no benefit. Keep listening.
As a professor, and he found that 69% of the time men are portrayed in the media in a negative light as buffoons, pedophiles, perverts. And what messages is sending to people across the United States? I mean, to men.
All right, so you give some tips about what men can do to fight back. For example, stop letting women control the dialogue.
That's the most important. Yes. Well, women now, in fact, here I am a woman, at least you're a man, and two women are talking about it. But women control the dialogue. Most of the articles and things about gender are written by women, or they're written by men who have a feminist bent. Men need to stand up and say, you know what? I'm going to write about it. I'm going to talk about it and quit being quiet. Men look at things in terms of cost analysis. And the penalties for marriage are so high and the rewards now are so low. First of all, there's legal costs of marriage. There are so many men now who are just saying, you know what, it's just not worth it to me. I'm going to be stuck paying the alimony. I'm going to be stuck paying for child support. And it's not just legal reasons. It's also psychological ones where men feel that basically they don't really have rights in marriage. Women hold all the cards now in reproduction and all kinds of things, and men don't.
Well, that's all true. I mean, I agree with that completely. But it still doesn't absolve men of the responsibility to stop complaining about how the cards are against them and man up and become men, because you don't become a man until you assume responsibility.
What man would take such a raw deal? I don't consider that a man.
Well, it's not a raw.
And this woman got more logic than this goofball. This is what you call a feminist, a male feminist, because he's not more or less considering the implications of marriage as it relates to a man and his rights. Stay away from men like this guy because he's dangerous.
Deal. You derive deep satisfaction as a man by taking responsibility for other people. That's the only place you get deep satisfaction.
So men are supposed to take a really bad deal and sign their rights away, and you call that a good deal. Look, you would understand economic rewards.
I did.
You did. Well, that's good, and maybe you have a really good wife, but a lot of men don't feel that way.
But see, Doctor, here's where I get confused. And forgive me, I just went to a wedding last night, so I'm feeling all loved up.
Euphoric.
Very, because it was beautiful. At any time you.
And that goes back to what we talked about a minute ago. The fickle notion of romantic love, which is very capricious, meaning it comes and it goes. It's very whimsical. A man should never get married on love alone. It should be more or less based on pragmatism. You can grow to love a woman. And I'm not saying you shouldn't look for similar commonalities, but that should be the last reason why you should get married, based on a fickle notion called love.
You do see a wedding, that the hope is renewed, and it does remind you of what's great about marriage. And so you act as though marriage is such a raw deal for men, but you do get companionship, and you get love, and you get a family, and I see men enjoying all of that and embracing all of that.
That's a different topic. Those are also things that you can get with a relationship. We're talking about the legal aspect of marriage. I'm talking about the political and the legal ramifications of marriage, where men aren't getting such a good deal there. And there are thousands of men across the country that I've spoken to and that will tell you differently. And the statistics are bearing that out. A lot of men, you think men need to man up, but to man up, you have to be getting something out of that relationship. What you're saying is that men are getting something just by having a woman. They're just so lucky.
Here's the thing. They're allowed. The one thing I agree with you on is men are getting away with having children without marrying the woman.
They're not getting away with it. What's happening is a lot of women, number one, don't want them. The lower level women, what's happening is 40% of the women who are breadwinners, a lot of those lower level women are making $17,000 to $23,000. Those women use the government to pay for themselves. They don't want a man. So rather than some men are just opting.
Why hasn't a man written this book? Why hasn't a man written this book?
Because men can't speak up. I'm here to speak up because people will actually listen to a woman. It's really unfortunate. I want the next man, and I'm hoping by this book that next man is out there.
What's frustrating? Hold on, I want to say something as a man, because this always has frustrated me when I see commercials when men sort of speak up, they're acting like men, right? And all these commercials are out there where the man's like the lazy guy on the couch.
He's a tool.
But look what the culture is doing to the men. Culture is telling men, you are no good. You are no good in marriage. You are no good. Even you all are hearing saying man up to men, and that's a really negative message to be
Very,
sending to
very
men.
negative.
But what do you think the solution is?
The solution is for us to have fair laws and things for men, and to also, these commercials, we need to look at the culture and say, you know what, quit treating men like trash. Seriously, we treat men very poorly in this society.
That's fascinating to me because as we've just gone through, all of the forces at work here to find that wages for men are actually less today. The median wage for men is less today than in 1968.
Exactly.
The implications of that are extraordinary. They can't support a family on that median.
That's one of the
wage.
reasons they can't support families. So lower income women don't want men as often, and lower income men are getting married less and less at all ages. And part of it is not just that they're going on strike, but the women a lot of times don't want lower level men. The other thing is women are becoming so highly educated.
Right, because women by nature are more or less only respect power and strength. You know, it's part of what's Briefalt's law is called hypergamy, where women more or less gravitate to the highest bidder. And a lot of times, you know, I jokingly said if Jesus himself came, some would probably divorce him. Because not all, and I'm not going to say all, but there are a large percentage of our women don't look at things through the lens of pragmatism. They do it based on their biology because women are nesters by nature. Finish listening to this.
Now that they want higher level men, and the men don't want to go to college anymore because colleges have become so feminized in some sense that a lot of men don't. It starts early in the earlier grades.
What do you mean feminized? I think, I mean, that resonates, but what do you mean?
I mean that everything has become about what girls need, what women need. It's not about what boys need. A lot of times boys are into mastery, they're into skill, competition, and our schools are so filled now with people who only look at sitting still, reading books that are basically for girls. And a lot of boys are interested in other things. They don't want to just sit still, and they want to learn in a different type of way, and the schools don't allow that. We have boys in this country who can't read, and nobody does anything about that. We also have so many female teachers. There are only 16% of teachers now are men in the elementary schools.
Is that right?
Yes, and those female teachers, according to the London School of Economics, did a study, and they found that female teachers as a whole give lower.
And I know that's right because I was a former teacher before I became a clinician. I worked in law enforcement. From law enforcement, I became a special ed teacher. And you would be more or less spellbound by how boys respond to male teachers, especially masculine male teachers like myself. But a lot of times boys are more or less demonized or vilified, even in the classroom. And especially black boys and Latino boys, you know, white boys as well, but Latin boys and black boys get it worse. And so everything that Dr. Smith is saying is very poignant. You need to get her book called Men on Strike. That's a powerful book. And they give you some of the proper and more or less cerebral reasons why men shouldn't get married until the laws change.
Remarks to boys.
Well, those son of a guns.
Yes.
Well, I don't know. Son of a guns. The reality is right now society is becoming such a constrained place. The political correctness, hidebound orthodoxies. Women are doing well, but not as well as it might be inferred. Right. For example, the Pew Research study just recently showing that women amount to 40% of the breadwinners. But when you look at those numbers, 63% of those women are on average earning $23,000 a year. Right. They are effectively dependent on the state. They are not breadwinners. It's the wrong term. They're not winning, and there's not much bread there.
But what's happening is they don't need men anymore. You see, they've let state have become their husband. The
state
state is now the husband.
That's a great way to put it.
That's exactly what it is. Husbands are now expendable.
And the state isn't. It's a level of dependency that is going to alter the way we live.
First of all, there's lots of these laws or rules in colleges. The colleges they say that if a man is found, it used to be a 90 to 100%, you had to find a man guilty of a sexual assault. And now on the college campuses that take federal funds, there was an Obama letter that in 2011 went out and it said, okay, any man that's found guilty of a sexual harassment or sexual abuse or a sexual assault, all we have to have is 50% in a feather. In other words, there's these campus administrators, they have what's called a campus tribunal, and they control young men's sexuality by saying, okay, we don't really need a large amount of evidence. All we need is we think you did it. And that young man can be thrown out of school. They can have their career options limited because who's going to want to hire a guy who's been accused of sexual abuse or harassment? And the other thing is people don't realize it, but in our society, for example, a young boy, and I have an example of this in my book, a young boy who's 14 or 15 who has sex with a 34-year-old woman, if she gets pregnant, that boy is liable for child support.
That's
Are you kidding?
I'm not
That
I'm
is
serious,
horrible.
and there's never been a case. Michael Higdon is a professor at the University of Tennessee, and he did a paper on this, and one of the things that the paper said is there's never been a case where a boy of that age has gotten off. If you were 14 or 15 and you have sex with an older woman, even if it's statutory rape, it doesn't matter. You're liable for child support.
Now, I got to interrupt with a question right here. But if it went the other way,
Exactly.
there was. I mean, if a guy rapes a girl, there's
There'd be an uproar. The man would be put in jail.
Yeah, but the girl. So the girl couldn't possibly be held responsible for.
No.
I mean, that's insane.
But that's the thing is people talk about how irresponsible boys are of that age, and then they turn around. They're always so responsible that they know exactly what they're doing, even if they're having sex with a 34-year-old woman, and then she's having his baby. I mean, of course he's responsible, right? Because that 14 or 15-year-old knows exactly what he's doing.
Right.
I just think it's sort of ironic when it.
Can you guys imagine if a man of equal age, higher age, did the same thing to a young lady? Can you imagine the shame and the hypocrisy and the double standard that will exist? But see, these are the inequities that more or less continue to permeate in this current culture that we live in. And that's why I, as a kosher clinician, has more or less determined to designate myself as an advocate for young boys and men, but also older men and boys as well. And so that's why it's very important to support platforms like this and more or less to give so we can continue to come up with viable content. Keep listening.
Comes to men, they're immature until you need to slap their hand or put them in jail or something. I don't really consider myself any type of feminist because the feminist movement, it seems like there has been a lot of power, and I think part of it's political. We have one of the interesting things is I found that about 30% of women in the United States consider themselves feminists, but when you look at the women who vote, it turns out that about 70% of those women consider themselves feminists. So I think a lot of times the laws are driven by, I kind of call it matriarchy by proxy, but men are afraid. Of course, if Barack Obama got up and said something negative towards women, he'd have a firestorm on his hands, just like we saw with Larry Summers, the president of Harvard.
Right.
Got ousted, as you know, because he said something that women didn't like. And so men are afraid they could lose their position. They could lose, their job. And then that's sort of why I wrote the book, is because I want to talk to men about how they need to speak out, because I think men are afraid to come forward or to say anything because we're so used to thinking of women as the victims in our society and that men can't be discriminated against.
Well, how do men handle this? How do men speak out, whether it's at a university? I mean, they'll get themselves in trouble. If it's on the job, they'll get themselves in trouble. If it's in a relationship, they'll get themselves in trouble. And they're taught this. They're taught to fear it, as you well document. So how do they go about it?
Well, I think there are different ways, and I talk in the book about, different ways to deal with it. Certainly, if you have a girlfriend or, somebody potentially that you want to marry, I talk about ways in the book to kind of, get to know this person for a longer period of time, sort of get a feeling for how they treat you. I think a lot of men jump into things. They feel if they like a woman or they sort of they get involved, and I think it's very hard for them to pull themselves back and to really put boundaries on women. And it's hard. Men aren't hardwired to. They're kind of hardwired more to protect women, and it's very hard for them to confront a woman and what she's doing. But I think that's a very necessary part of a relationship, is that you have to be forward about what you will and won't tolerate.
Right.
When you see a woman for the first time do something that's, maybe she makes fun of men, or maybe she tells you you're not going out with your friends, or maybe she starts to put a lot of boundaries on
That
women.
should be a red flag.
Exactly.
Yeah. How are you accepted or not accepted in academia and by your friends? I mean, what's your life like having these thoughts and beliefs?
I used to be sort of a big feminist, so my family was driven crazy by those thoughts. Now they just sort of tune me out.
Well, wait a minute. How'd you change?
I think it went so far the other way. I think as I got older, when I was younger, it seemed to me that women had some of these problems, and then I realized as I got older that indeed that the society had changed, that the problems that women used to have in some sense have turned around, and there's like a backlash against men. Also, I think because I've seen so many men in my practice, 20 years ago, I had a practice in New York, and one of the first patients I had was a man who was being beaten by his wife, and I couldn't get any help for him. And I realized at that point that, yes, men had, it was a very serious problem. And from there, I just became more open to it. But as far as myself, I mean, people don't bother me too much. Most people are, I think a lot of times people are surprised, or if I talk to women about the book that I wrote, they think it's like a cute book that a psychologist wrote. That
Right.
How do you rope a man in or whatever? But I think most men get it. I don't even have to say anything, but they totally get it. And you see this look of like this in their eyes, sort of like, oh yeah, I get that. And you don't really have to say that much to them.
And that's another thing, domestic violence in this country, and people don't understand. If you say that men get beaten too by their wives or spouses or whatever, or that it's a problem with men on the receiving end, they look at you like you're some kind of nut job. But all you got to do is look at the Justice Department statistics.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's true, and there's actually been some really good research that's come out, even from the National Institutes of Health.
And that's what Dr. T. Hazan Johnson actually talks about a lot, that in relationships, it's in violence, in domestic violence, it's bidirectional. It's not always one-on-one, meaning men hit women, men be bad. He talked about that a lot. Go support that brother. But there are a lot of, like I said, social inequities that are more or less going on there. And that's why these platforms are so viable, not only from an anecdotal perspective, but also from a clinical perspective. So once again, shout out to Dr. Helen Smith.
And other places that show that about 50% of the time, women are instigating domestic violence, and that's a high level. People think like, oh, men don't really get hurt, but what happens is men just don't really report it, and we don't really think if a man has a black eye. I mean, remember Amy Winehouse? I mean, she had this boyfriend or husband, and you'd always see him in the papers with a black eye that she gave him. We would never accept that. If a woman has a black eye, like we're seeing with this recent case with Nigella Lawson, the I don't know if you're following that, but the cook, the lady who's a chef on TV. There's a bunch of stuff in the papers all about how her husband tried to choke her.
Right, yes, and they got the picture of his hand on her neck in the restaurant or something.
And they're trying to, I've even heard reports about how people want to go after him. They want him arrested, this, that, and the other thing. But they used to show pictures of Amy Winehouse's husband all the time with a big black eye that she'd beaten him and punched him in the eye, and nobody cares because people just don't think that it hurts.
And once again, that's what happens in modern America. So I want you guys to ask yourself the question once again. Is marriage a viable outcome for men in these modern times? And I want you to look at things through the lens of pragmatism, as I spoke about earlier. If it is viable, then you should take the keenest and the more or less sharpest, more or less analytical perspective before you get married. But if it's not a viable outcome, I think you need to remain single. And remember this, if it ain't 7, it ain't kosher. If it ain't kosher, it ain't right. And so I'm going to say that marriage in this modern milieu is not viable. I want you to enjoy this Saturday. And I want you to spend this time and this day reflecting. And do me a favor, please donate to $7 Smalls. Please donate to $7 Smalls for the Cash App, for my Cash App. And I greatly appreciate it. Be well. Faith is before you. Choose wisely.